Hello, my name is Caleb Aurora, and today I am here to introduce you to Easy History Lessons. This is Professor Swift.
Good afternoon.
Professor Swift is a professor from Palm Beach State College who has a master's in history. In my opinion, and in my mom's opinion, if you knew half of everything he knew in history, you'd be able to pass every single test in your life. Easy History Lessons is an easy way to learn history without paying any money. All you have to do is watch our videos.
Our topic today is the U.S. Civil War. Now, it's obviously not going to be a topic we're going to cover in one day, but a series of days. Now, to properly introduce this topic, I want to talk a little bit about the vast differences in resources of the Confederacy and the Union. First of all, the population of the Confederacy was about 9 million. Population of the North was a little over 22 million. But even that is misleading because some 40% of the population of the Confederacy was enslaved. So in terms of the white population, or should I say the free population of the North, and everyone was free in the North, although not all citizens, that's another subject we'll come back to. You have a discrepancy of some 4-to-1 in terms of manpower. That in itself is significant. But even more significant is the vast difference in the industrial production of the Union versus the Confederacy. That is well over 10 times. And when one considers the production of iron and steel, that advantage is way more than 10 times. In fact, it will be noted that during the Civil War, the city of Springfield, Massachusetts, outproduced the entire Confederacy. The Springfield Arsenal was unquestionably the industrial center of the country during the Civil War, but vastly, as I say, outproduced the entire Confederacy. So you have enormous manpower and industrial resources wielded by the Union. You also have enormous financial resources. In addition to that, you also have an existing infrastructure. You have an existing army and navy, an existing government, whereas the Confederates have to build everything from scratch. In fact, it should be noted, the Confederate ability to arm and man its armies in the field was an extraordinary accomplishment considering the disadvantages against them. Now, that overwhelming advantage in terms of manpower and industrial resources will be what defeats the Confederacy in the end. But it's not going to be a quick war. It's going to be 4 years. Hold on, stop it. I'm not sure I mentioned AP. I'm not sure. Now, the reason that it took 4 years to defeat the Confederacy is that there were a number of advantages that the Confederacy enjoyed. And while it didn't culminate in ultimate victory, it did manifest itself in prolonging the conflict. What were those advantages? Well, first of all, the obvious size of the Confederacy. We're talking over 900,000 square miles of territory. That's not an easy task for any conquering army to secure 900,000 square miles of territory. So just the vast geography involved was a challenge. The South would undoubtedly enjoy a major advantage in terms of its capability to gather intelligence on the enemy. The very capital itself was in Washington, D.C., was on slave territory. So they had no trouble finding Confederate sympathizers here, there, and everywhere in the nation's capital. But in addition to that, the fighting was taking place on Southern soil, and soil that was ripe with Confederate spies and a very sophisticated spy network. It's often said that, at least in the first couple of years of the war, the Confederate commanders often got the marching orders of the Union Army of the Potomac before the commanders of the Union Army of the Potomac received those orders. So we have the vast size we have the spy gathering capability of the Confederacy, all related to the fact that the Confederacy is fighting this war on its own turf, and the fact that it's fighting a defensive war, with two exceptions, and we'll talk about that in this series. And when you're fighting on the defensive, you can hold off an army far greater in size. It's much easier to defend a position than to attack one when you're dug in. There's also the advantage of knowing the terrain you're on, knowing where to cross a river, knowing where to set up an ambush, and so forth. Lastly, there's the advantage of what we refer to in military terms as interior lines. If you're moving from point A to point B and you're on the defensive side here, holding off an army, it's a short distance. But if you're the attacking army and you want to move from point A to point B, it's a long way. That gives the enemy more time. You have to set up supply lines, which makes them vulnerable. The time is money, if you will. So the advantage of supply, shorter supply lines, is going to be a big advantage for the Confederacy. Now, as the war drags on, the North will build a vast rail network that will offset that advantage. The one big advantage the Confederacy has, though, more than anything else, is that they have a preponderance of the superior generals for at least the first 2 years of the war. And as a result of that, they're able to stalemate the fighting in the major theater of war, the Eastern Theater. Now, like every war, you got to have a strategy. Confederate strategy, for the most part, is pretty simple. Hold off the enemy. Drag this war out until the enemy loses its will to fight. As the casualties mount, hopefully opposition will mount, and the Confederacy, in the eyes of the Confederacy, will be able to achieve its independence. There's a danger to that strategy. Because if the other side doesn't lose the will to fight, and they have vastly more resources, then it's inevitable that you're going to lose. Nevertheless, this appears to be the best strategy the Confederates will come up with, and I would say that it really was the best strategy that they could have come up with. Now, they will take the offensive if an opportunity presents itself, but never to conquer the North or to acquire stretches of northern territory, more to gain a strategic victory here and there, sometimes for psychological or even diplomatic reasons. We'll talk about that later on in this series. The Union strategy is a little more complex. Beginning of the war, the highest ranking general in the U.S. Army was Winfield Scott. He was a hero of the Mexican War. Lincoln had actually offered him field command of the Union armies, but General Scott was old and he weighed over 300 pounds. He couldn't get on a horse, and that was essential back then for field command. But he did offer a strategy which was leaked to the media, quickly became known as the Anaconda Plan. It was a plan that would squeeze the Confederacy to death. Now, the first part of this Anaconda Plan was a blockade of the southern coastline, from Virginia all the way to Louisiana. That was the first component of this so-called Anaconda Plan. The main thrust, though, would come down the Mississippi River, with the idea of dividing the Confederacy in two. This coming down the Mississippi River would, first of all, secure the river itself, which was a vital transportation and communications link to the Confederacy. But it would also divide the Confederacy in half and make it difficult to supply itself in a number of ways, manpower-wise, food-wise, etc. Lincoln takes notice of the Anaconda Plan, but never fully adopts it. Lincoln decides to add a couple more components. He wants to put relentless pressure on the Confederate capital of Richmond. So he wants to make this the major theater of war. ironic that this is only 100 miles between D.C. and Richmond, and yet it will take 4 years to get there. The other tweak, you could say, that President Lincoln adds to the plan is to attack on many different fronts at the same time. That prevents the enemy from defending just one or two positions. Spreads him out thin. It's a similar strategy to what Roosevelt and Churchill utilized along with the Russians to defeat Nazi Germany. So that's our introduction. This is a very significant battle for a number of reasons. First of all, the Battle of Shiloh was the first what we call mega battle of the Civil War, the first battle in which there were 20,000 or more casualties. And in this two-day battle, there were some 24,000 killed and wounded on both sides. To put that in perspective, there were more people killed the Battle of Shiloh than in all the battles and skirmishes of the American Civil War. Of the American Revolution, which was 8 years, 1775 to 1783. More people killed at the Battle of Shiloh than in the 8 years of the American Revolution on the battlefields of that conflict. So, Shiloh is the first really super bloody battle. But what's interesting about this battle is it was also the first battle fought in the Western Theater, the first major battle. And unlike the Eastern Theater, where we're going to see that for some 2 years the Union armies were thwarted in every attempt to do whatever they were trying to do, whether it was take Richmond or smash a Confederate army here or there. From the very beginning with Shiloh, the Union Army was successful. Now again, this is either because the Union and President Lincoln consciously saw the strategic value and focused on it far greater, or was it simply because they just didn't ignore it as much as the Confederacy did? Might be a little of both. But the truth is that the Union armies were very successful, excuse me just a moment, in their endeavors in the Western Theater. Now, the reason why Shiloh was such a very important location is because following what will become this Union victory, hold on a second. Go on, mute me here. You know what? I'm going to turn my phone off here. There we go. Oh gosh, he's relentless. Following this victory, the Union is going to find itself strategically in a very important position from which to undertake even more successful campaigns in the future in the West. Now, let's talk about the battle. Gets off to a very bad start for the Union. In fact, such a bad start that General Grant will end up being relieved. He's the commander of the what was called the Army of the Ohio, eventually be merged into the Army of Tennessee, as we talked about in the introduction. But the Grant is, in fact, slow to react, and it looks like the Confederate armies are poised for a major victory. Now, they had considerably less forces. They had 40,000 troops. The Union Army had some 63,000. But the Confederates attack in such a way that the Union Army isn't able to bring its full force to bear. And some will argue that the Confederate Army was, in fact, going to achieve a victory, but then, as they say, all heck breaks loose. The Confederate commander, a very capable Albert Sidney Johnston, no relation to Joseph E. Johnston, by the way, we talked about at the Peninsula campaign, who will recover from his wounds. Albert Sidney was killed almost instantly. He was considered by many military historians to be one of the finer logisticians of the war. And Johnston will be killed right at about the time when the Confederates appeared to be on their way to a victory. And that sudden disruption in the senior campaign creates all kinds of problems with command and control of the Confederate armies, gives Grant a little extra time to recoup, and the Union gathers its superior forces and wins the battle. Now, history has kind of shown that Grant behaved here, if you will, much better than what was viewed at the time. As I mentioned, Grant will actually be relieved of his command, given a desk job for a while. He'll have to fight his way back, if you will. And he'll obviously do so very successfully. But he was treated, what most historians will say, very unfairly. The credit of the battle at the time, the credit for the victory, was given to Grant's corps commanders. But the truth is, really, that Grant really did, or should, I should say, bear the bulk of responsibility for the Union victory at Shiloh. Now, as a result of the Battle of Shiloh, the Union is able to retake the first Confederate state, the state of Tennessee. So that's the beginning, you could say, of major territorial losses for the Confederacy. Also, this places the Union in control of a very large segment of the Mississippi River that was in Confederate hands. So this is a major step toward fulfilling that Anaconda Plan, if you will, which is part of Lincoln's plan. Although this drive down the center of the Confederacy along the Mississippi is certainly not the primary part of Lincoln's plan, as it was with the Anaconda Plan proposed by General Winfield Scott. It's certainly a major component, and strategically, this is a major victory for the Union. So we have the first major bloody battle of the war, the first state falling, Confederate state falling back into the hands of the Union, or being retaken, I guess I should say, by the Union. And we also have a major part of the Mississippi River in the hands now, on Southern territory, in the hands of the Union Army. I want to follow up on something, though, about retaking Tennessee. All kinds of issues, political issues, were raised as a result of that. How do we treat Tennessee? Is Tennessee going to be pretty much allowed to come back into the Union and let bygones be bygones, or is the military going to remain in charge, which means, of course, that President Lincoln is in charge because he's the commander-in-chief? Well, it's going to be the latter. But a plan for reconstruction will begin, a plan for the political and social reintegration of the Confederate states. Now, remember, the Union can never admit that these states left. If they did so, that would be conceding that they had legally done so. And that would refute whatever outcome on the battlefield ultimately belies. But the reality is they did leave. They formed another country, whether that's an insurrection or a rightful constitutional course of action. Not too many would argue the latter.
I disagree. I disagree.
Uh-oh.
They left in. I mean, well.
You think they left legally?
No, I mean they.
No, well then you're agreeing with me then.
They didn't leave.
Yes, they did not leave legally because, first of
They
all, 40% of the
left,
people
but it
couldn't
wasn't
vote.
legal.
No, they left, but it wasn't legal. That's what I'm saying. So we are on the same page here.
So,
They left.
So you
but
said
it wasn't
45%, and you mean 40, don't you?
Of what?
Of 40% of the people in Confederacy are actually slaves.
About 40. About 40. Yeah. Did I say 45?
Yes.
Oh, I goofed. So yeah, about 40% didn't vote in the matter. On the other hand, the people never actually voted. It was the political leadership in the South that took the South down this path, but that's a whole other story. So Shiloh, major victory. The Western Theater, right up here, the Western Theater. We've got a Union victory. The first major battle, mega battle of the war. The first major battle was the First Battle of Bull Run. First mega battle, but the first battle in which the Union has prevailed in the Western Theater. You could say it's 2-1 on the scoreboard, Confederates over Union. But I want to follow up something. This victory, as do nearly all the victories in the Western Theater, never really get the press coverage, never really get the attention anywhere, in any circles, political circles, even military circles, as do the battles in the main theater. Of course, these main battles are being fought in and around the capitals of each country. If you want to call the Confederacy a country. But they get the attention. And even though we're going to see, as late as a year from the war ending, in fact, less than a year, there are people crying out for peace with the Confederacy among the Democrats. In late 1864, militarily, the war is almost won because of what's happened in the West. And yet, people are ignoring that and still focusing primarily on the East. I think that is probably enough for right now.